Just last week, Jeremy Hunt gave a speech where he said this:
declinism about Britain is just wrong. It's always been wrong in the past, and it's wrong today. Some of the gloom is based on statistics that don't reflect the whole picture.
That was the Chancellor of the Exchequer begging people to be more positive about the UK economy. Economists, though, haven't been heeding his call. This was Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics, speaking to CNN this week.
The nature of poverty has changed. So you talked about the late 70s, early 80s. The predictor of whether you were going to be poor in this country then was if you were old or if you were unemployed. Now, a majority of poor households do contain at least one worker because of the way that wages at the lower end, it's also been the case in the US, have fallen down relative to others. And I think it's striking, we say we're a rich country, we're a G7 country, but the poorest fifth of the population are now much poorer here than most of the poorest countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So there is a big chunk of the population for whom that is not the case, that they do not live in a rich country. They actually would be better off, even as a poor household, they would be better off in quite poor countries in the European Union. So that's a growing issue which predates Brexit.
So Stephanie Flanders, very much a mainstream economist, made a really important point there. We've long known that Britain is more unequal than most of our peers in Europe, but the justification has normally been, that we need inequality to drive growth, and that growth will mean poor people are better off in the long run. So you might be poorer compared to the rich, but a rising tide will lift all boats. That's the argument we've been fed for about 4 decades. Now, that was always bullshit. Germany and the Scandinavian countries have always had lower inequality and higher growth than Britain. That's always been the case. But now, as Stephanie Flanders was explaining, that also applies to the ex-communist countries of Eastern Europe. So countries we thought were much poorer than ourselves. It's better to be poor there than here. So she didn't specify exactly what country she was talking to. There's an FT article recently saying Slovenia is much better to be poor in Slovenia than poor in Britain, a country that we've traditionally thought of as much poorer than ourselves. I think, to be fair, it is one of the richer countries of Eastern Europe. I think Czech Republic is in a similar situation. Another economist who hasn't got Jeremy Hunt's message to be positive is Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation. He said this to Politics Joe this week.
The big picture that people need to understand about the British economy is that we're living with the results of 2 different decades. So we're living with the high inequality that the 1980s gave us. When earnings spread out, we saw a big increase in unemployment for those on lowest incomes, but those at the top of the middle did really well in the 1980s. And although inequality, everyone says it's always getting worse, broadly that's not true. Broadly, we're just living with the inequality of the 1980s. That's given us a high level of inequality, the highest of any major economy in Europe. And then on top of that, we've got the slow growth of the 2010s, the stagnation of the 2010s. And it's the two together that define the big picture of Britain in the 2020s before the cost of living crisis came on and smacked us in the face. On your bigger question, which is why is a rich country struggling broadly, which is a good question for us all to be focused on, then I think it is this interaction between the slow growth that's meant that we have got poorer relative to the countries we consider ourselves comparable to. Maybe we shouldn't, but we do. So France, Germany, the Netherlands, some people in America, the ones that are more on the optimistic end. But like Australia, Canada, those are the countries, I think those are reasonable comparisons. Those are the ones I think most punters have in their heads as like, okay, we're a bit like that. The slow growth of the last 15 years, so not just after 2010, but before 2010, big financial crisis, people remember, when I was busy nationalising banks in the Treasury, that slower growth means that on average, we're a lot poorer than those countries now. And then when you take into account that we're more unequal than all of the ones I mentioned, except for the US, which is like an inequality basket case, so let's forget them. But all the others, we're more unequal. Once we take that into account, poorer households in Britain are far poorer than poorer households in France, Germany, right? And that's the key problem. And then when you have a cost of living crisis driven by the cost of essentials, so energy, food, which are imported, so we don't set the price. There's a global price for them, or at least a European price for energy. So we've got to pay it, whatever. Then poor households are going to really struggle. And they're going to struggle particularly in the UK because they're so much poorer than their equivalents in France and Germany.
Aaron, Jeremy Hunt wants everyone to be positive about the UK economy. Economists aren't following suit. They're not following his lead. Is he going to be pissed off?
Well, we've been hearing this for 15 years. Be positive, be upbeat. Again, it's very easy for Jeremy Hunt to say in his Savile Row suit and his, Viola Milano or God knows what tie he's wearing, £200 tie. He's probably wearing a tie that's, costs more than, what we give somebody for 2 weeks on job seekers allowance. It's very easy for him to say that our best days are ahead of us. No, they ain't. No, they ain't. We've had 15 appalling years in this country. We're halfway through a second lost decade. We're going to have a third lost decade at this rate. What I find particularly interesting, Michael, is he had Stephanie Flanders there saying, oh, this is terrible, bad decisions have been made. The UK now is structurally screwed. I think it's going to take a really long time to turn this around. A really long time. And I don't want to say that because, of course, it lets a future Labour government or a left-wing government off the hook because they can say, well, we can't deliver everything because we have to be realistic. But it's also true. The decisions that were made, I think, between 2008 and 2015, particularly after 2010 by the coalition government, were history-making. They were epochal. They will have implications to this country for decades. And ironically, Stephanie Flanders was a BBC journalist at the time. She was one of a coterie of journalists at the BBC. I think cheerleading austerity. Maybe my memory is failing me, but I do distinctly recall her leaving the BBC to work at JP Morgan in 2013. Probably says something about her, her political commitments to journalism or making lots of money. Often the two don't go together. So it is interesting that now somebody like Stephanie Flanders can look back and go, oh, austerity, that was a bad idea. You weren't saying that in 2010 when actually it kind of mattered what you had to think on the subject. Torsten Bell has been far more consistent, coherent on the subject, as he advised at Ed Miliband prior to 2015, I believe, as economics advisor. And yes, it's very easy to say as an economist, the government are getting it wrong. What I find really interesting, Michael, is a former journalist who was cheerleading austerity now saying, actually, that was a really bad look. I wonder who's responsible. Well, in part, you, Stephanie.
Yeah, it still doesn't seem like people, because there is this broad recognition now that Britain is poor. We're doing badly. We've got poorer, or we've stagnated while other people have overtaken us, and it's especially bad. I do think that Torsten Bell, he's been doing sort of the media round recently, and it is very coherent what he's saying. He's saying we have this double problem, which we have high levels of inequality and low levels of growth. That's especially bad for people at the bottom, right? Because if you have high levels of inequality, but you're also growing really fast, then, to some degree, the rising tide will lift to some degree some boats. It's overstated basically everywhere. But if you've got the worst of both worlds, then you're in the shitty situation that we are in. I'm sure he puts forward, some real social democratic solutions. But I think you are seeing this admission from so many people that growth isn't working. And I don't really see this consensus towards saying, well, look, the reason they have higher standards of living on the continent is because they invest shed loads more money in their economy. Like there's no one sort of saying, oh, the reason France has higher productivity, they work fewer hours for higher incomes, is because their tax rate is 50%, and therefore the state is able to take a real leading role in investment into the economy. It seems odd to me that we've got both this widespread recognition that our economic model is broken, and then also this new consensus that tax isn't allowed to rise, right? Because if you look at all those countries which are doing better, America is slightly different. America has lower taxes and higher levels of growth, but they're also like the world hegemon, the whole world uses the dollar, somewhat exceptional. If you look at countries which aren't America on the continent, they all have higher levels of tax, higher growth, higher investment, higher wages. So why have we, got this now unchallenged consensus that because tax is at 37% of GDP, it can't possibly go any higher? What do you think about that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Michael. I think that the comparison as well with the United States, Torsten Bell says it's a bit sort of wishful thinking to say that we should be as wealthy as the US. GDP per capita, I think in 2007, 6, 7, we briefly overtook the US. Now, look, these numbers don't mean very much necessarily, right? The US has a lower life expectancy than Cuba. You're more likely to be a woman dying in childbirth in the United States than in Bosnia. High rates of gun crime, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not captured in GDP statistics because you get really rich people and really poor people. But it does tell you something. And clearly in the last 15 years, the US has really flown away from the UK, as have the other countries you mentioned, Canada, Australia, Netherlands, France, not France really, Netherlands, a few of the Nordics, really, really flown away. Like, $10,000, $15,000 wealthier than we are when they were broadly the same as us 15 years ago. On the America point as well, on the United States, I really think this is lost on a lot of UK viewers, people generally, right? Not everybody in the UK watches Novara Media. If you're a graduate in the United States, you are so much better off than you are in the UK. So much better off, like immeasurably immeasurably better off. The graduate dividend in the US, I think, is about 3 to 4 times what it is now in the UK. We're now at a point, really, with several industries, and nursing is the cutting edge of this, where actually it makes no sense to go to university and to get the £56,000 worth of debt, because you're not going to earn a significant amount of money more over the duration of your career to make that worthwhile, basically. Whereas the United States, and like he said, it's spiraling inequality, crazy inequality compared to the UK even, while nursing in the US is remunerated to a far better extent than it is here. Far better. And I think this is really lost on a lot of Brits, Mike. We think, well, we've got the NHS. Oh, thank God we're not in the US. Well, actually, for a really big minority of people, not everybody, I wouldn't want to be very poor in the US. But if you're middle income or even lower middle income, personally, right now, if I was somebody under 30 with a university degree, I would rather be in the United States. And then having been in Poland last year, you go to a city like Poznan, Gdansk, Warsaw, Katowice, any of these big cities. Again, I would far rather be a graduate under 30 in these countries. Now, I'm not going to go into, and why am I saying somebody older? Well, because in the UK, if you're older, you tend to be an asset owner and you're benefiting from these overinflated assets, right? Park that for a moment. But for most people who are really missing out, or even say 40, somebody under 40 who rents, has a university degree, I don't know how you can make the argument it's better to live here than in Poland, having been there. And just to conclude on what you were saying earlier, Michael, Slovenia is overtaking us. I think basically by 2030, Poland's going to be in the same situation, right? And that is a very remarkable statistic. If you said to somebody in 1990 that Poland will be a more prosperous country on a per capita basis, by PPP is the best way to do it because it's in local currency. On a per person basis, Poland will be wealthier than the UK. You would have been laughed out of town. It's happening. It's happening. And it's happening because of political decisions made after 2010 in particular. And Michael, to answer your point, well, they recognize the scale of the problems, but they're not really willing to talk about the plausible solutions. This is ideology, isn't it? You say, oh my God, I've just lost my hand and you're holding the saw in your other hand, but you don't realize cause and effect because we haven't reached that point yet. I mean, to really sum that up, I saw on Twitter earlier this week, a former Conservative advisor saying, if only Britain had a sovereign wealth fund and we'd invested the revenues generated by North Sea oil into that like Norway did. Yeah, if only. A lady called Margaret Thatcher decided precisely not to do that. Even for somebody like Tony Blair, that was a ridiculous proposal. And yet here we are, Conservatives saying, actually, that was probably a good idea. Too late. Too late. And for 10 years, people on the left opposing austerity saying, we need to build a high productivity economy through reinvestment, higher rates of tax, the public sector. We were laughed at. And guess what? We were right. But it's not about being right. It's about affecting change. And Michael, I think it's a really important point you make, which is that these very powerful people who at least now observe the country is getting poorer, well, that's a start. What's it going to take for them to realize that the reason why we're getting poorer is because of their ideas?
You might be watching this thinking, look, the Financial Times is now on our side. Stephanie Flanders is now on our side. That's a good thing. Why don't you just celebrate it? And on one level, yes, it's a good thing. I celebrate it. Although they've only been pushed to that position because everything is so terrible for everyone. So it's not exactly something to celebrate, but great. I'll take whatever allies we can get. But the reason the self-criticism matters is because potentially the reasons they made those mistakes in the 2010s is will lead them to make similar mistakes in the 2020s, right? And I do think tax is the big issue there. So people now seem to have recognized, oh, austerity was a bad idea. But why didn't you realize that at the time? Oh, because you were listening to the rich and powerful. Well, now when there is this sort of broad consensus that even a Labour government wouldn't be able to increase taxes at all, is the reason that is a broad consensus that no one is willing to challenge because it's true, everyone's learned and everyone's now brilliant at economics? Or is it because they're still listening to the rich and powerful? And the rich and powerful aren't particularly interested in austerity anymore because they recognize it was a failure. All they want is, they're happy for the state to be active so long as their taxes don't get increased. If you got austerity wrong, ask why you got austerity wrong. And now look at yourself and think, are we getting taxes wrong this time around, right? Because we need the next Labour government to massively increase taxes, especially on the rich. But I mean, I wouldn't mind it being broad-based either. In France and in Scandinavia, taxes for everyone are a bit higher, but it's worth it because you get a much richer public sphere and your wages are higher anyway because of high levels of investment. So I'm not someone who thinks tax all has to be on the top 5%, but obviously it should be disproportionately on the top 5%. We all should be paying more, but you can't say that in public life, just as you couldn't say in the 2010s that the public debt doesn't really matter, or at least getting it down isn't the number one priority. And I feel like it's this sort of people holding this sort of these two kind of positions which are in tension. We were totally wrong in the 2010s, but we're not going to ask why. And the dogmas we have in the 2020s, we're not going to question them either. We're going to get to the 2030s, then all these people are going to say, oh, yeah, maybe we should have increased tax in the 2020s.